Here we are in Fukushima and in Chernobyl looking at long-lived radiation because those plants blew up and they blew out cesium, strontium-90, iodine that lasts for a long time in the environment, for literally hundreds of years.
Today, I'm so honored to have these guests here at DePaul University. Let me introduce Dr. Sarah Lavinger, who is introducing our guest today. She's a practicing physician and currently Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility at Chicago chapter. So, thank you.
Thanks. So as Yuki said, my name is Dr. Sarah Lavinger. I'm a practicing physician. I'm the director of the Chicago chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility. For those of you who don't know, Physicians for Social Responsibility is a national organization that was formed in 1961. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And as I like to say, we're the folks who helped to bring you nuclear test ban treaties. PSR was founded during the Cold War when physicians began to be worried about exposure to radiation, radioactive fallout from the testing of atomic bombs, a lot of which was occurring above ground. PSR was very active in putting in place a lot of test ban treaties, and for that we shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 with International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. The Chicago chapter has been around for 20 years. So not only do we work on informing the public about the dangers of nuclear power plants and nuclear war, but we also are involved in a lot of local environmental issues. So, feel free to check out our website, email me. I'd love to have you come to our events. But tonight, I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker tonight, Dr. Jeff Patterson, is a family practice physician from Madison, the immediate past president of National PSR, and a national expert on radiation and health. We're really honored to have Dr. Patterson here tonight because he's really an expert on radiation and health, and he'll really fill you in on why radiation is all around us and why it's a health hazard. He has made more than 20 trips to the Soviet Union and Russia, and has made several trips to Chernobyl. So on this 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, we're really lucky to have him to teach us about that. I'm also really pleased to present Dave Kraft, a social worker by training. He formed the Nuclear Energy Information Service, NEIS, here in Chicago in 1981 to provide the public with information about the potential health hazards of nuclear power plants. And Dave is active in lots of Chicago events. He does a lot of speaking. He's written for a lot of local publications. And we're also really lucky to have him tonight. So I'm going to have Dr. Patterson get started. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, it's delightful to be here. As Sarah mentioned, my life has gotten busier because of this catastrophe. And it's ironic that today is the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, and at the same time we're experiencing another major disaster. These are not the only two disasters that have happened in the nuclear industry, and we'll talk a bit about those. So what I wanted to do this evening was to talk a bit about radiation. There are a lot of questions and concerns that people have. It's amazing the phone calls that I've received from people around the country and from patients who are very worried about the Fukushima situation. I had a woman call me and she was going to a conference in San Diego, And she said, I see this radiation coming from Fukushima, and I am 5 months pregnant. Should I go to the conference in San Diego? So what would you tell her? And how many would say, don't go to the conference because you're 5 months pregnant? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. And not an unreasonable thing. And that's actually what she decided. And she was so concerned about any additional radiation that her infant might have, and we'll talk about why that's an important issue, that she decided not to go. But these are difficult decisions that we all face, because these disasters don't remain local. They go worldwide. We had a movie up here a little earlier about the distribution of cesium from Chernobyl, and we'll maybe put it up at the end again. But let's do a little bit of primer on nuclear power and nuclear weapons, because these two go hand in hand. You cannot separate nuclear power from nuclear weapons. They are one and the same, and we'll talk more about that as well. I talk about the 3 poisonous P's of nuclear power, and those are pollution, which we're seeing another example of right now, and that pollution is long-lived. It doesn't go away. It's not going to go away for hundreds of years. Price, it is a very expensive way to boil water for electricity. And that's basically what it is. We're boiling water to create steam to run turbines to produce electricity. And it's a very expensive, hazardous way to do that. And then proliferation. And we talked about the fact that the nuclear weapons industry and the nuclear power industry are one and the same. It's like hand in glove. So keep these 3 poisonous P's of nuclear power in mind as we go through both of our talks this evening. They are very important. Well, we need to learn about radiation. David Lilienthal, who was the first head of the nuclear power industry in the United States, said there used to be 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And now we need to learn about radiation. And the reason is that it's affecting all of your lives. And it will affect the lives of your children and your grandchildren and generations to come in ways that have never been seen in the world. It's a very different R. And the biological effects, the Beer Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation report, that is a government report done by the Academy of Sciences, has several editions of it, but the latest one, and actually through all of them, came to the conclusion after looking at all of the scientific literature in the world, and very thorough. You can download this on the internet. It's a thick book about like this, so it'll be good to put you to sleep if you have insomnia problems. The Beer Commission said there is no safe dose of radiation. There's a direct linear relationship between dose and cancer production. And they looked at other things too, other health effects, but most of it was looking at cancer effects and genetic changes when radiation comes into your body. And so this is a very important concept. There is no safe dose. There is no harmless dose. And you hear this all the time after nuclear accidents. We're hearing it from Japan today, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. There was a release of radiation from this nuclear power plant, but no harm to human health. Well, that's a ludicrous statement, because in order to know what the harm to human health is, you have to watch the human population for literally the lifetime of that population that is exposed. And if that population is exposed to nuclides that are released and stay in the ground and in the water and in the atmosphere and come back through the plants again and again, like cesium, strontium-90, plutonium, then those effects are going to go on for generation after generation after generation. And so to make this statement makes absolutely no sense. And there's scientific backing for this. Cancer and the effects of radiation. A single exposure to radiation is sufficient to cause increased cancer incidence years later. When we expose a population of people to a certain amount of radiation, we are going to get cancers from that. If you give a CAT scan, and a CAT scan is an X-ray procedure that's commonly done in medicine, to an infant, a chest CAT scan, that infant has a 1 in 200 chance of developing cancer from that CAT scan. And so there is no free lunch with radiation. Radiation-induced cancers are indistinguishable from naturally induced cancers. We see a lot of cancer in the world, probably due some to chemicals and maybe synergistic with chemical exposures and radiation exposures. And most cancers, various types of cancers, skin cancer, prostate cancer, bladder cancer, breast cancer, etc., are increased in incidence after irradiation. And the effects are cumulative. So if you get one CAT scan and then you get another 2 years later and another and another and another, like the patient I had who came in recently, a young woman in her 30s with irritable bowel syndrome, and I looked back through her chart and there were 8 CAT scans listed in her chart. Plus, she'd been to some other hospitals in Iowa and had a couple more. That's cumulative. Okay. And the same with the exposure from Hiroshima, from testing, nuclear testing, etc. It's all cumulative. Now, when we think about this, one individual in 1,000 will develop a cancer from a 10 millisievert exposure, which is like a whole body CAT scan, but a whole body CAT scan will probably give a much more radiation than that. In fact, in medical studies, it's been shown that even in the same hospital, getting a chest CT, the radiation varies as much as 13 times. So one person may get 10 millisieverts and another may get 13 times that in the same hospital. So there's very little standardization even in medicine for this. We get radiation basically from 3 sources. One is background radiation. And you hear this all the time from the nuclear industry, don't you? We live in a sea of radiation. You're getting it from the bananas you eat. You're getting it from people. You get close to somebody and you get the radiation from, you know, them because they got strontium-90 in their body, etc. All right. So we live in a sea of radiation. So how can it harm us? It does harm us. The background radiation, even though it's a low dose, is not harmless. And that's why when you have a house and you test the basement for radon, if the radon level is too high, you can't sell that house. You can't get a mortgage on the house. You have to fix it. You have to ventilate the basement so that the radon, which is background radiation, doesn't cause lung cancer. And if you're younger, the effect is much worse. If you're an infant, then you've got a long time. If you're my age and you get a CAT scan, the effect is not as bad as it would be if you're an infant or if you're in utero. And that's even worse. Well, there's a lot of conflicting data that you're seeing now on the anniversary of Chernobyl about how many deaths occurred in Chernobyl. How many have seen that? Have you seen conflict about that? Yeah. And so what do you believe about this? What do we know about this? Well, the WHO and IAEA, which are like hand in glove, World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Association, do work together. And in fact, they have a compact that they signed that says that the World Health Organization cannot publish anything about the health effects of radiation without the approval of the IAEA. And the IAEA, in its charter, was set up specifically to promote nuclear energy. To promote nuclear energy. So what do you think they're going to say? And the history of the nuclear industry through the whole time has been one of minimization, secrecy, and cover-up. And we'll talk about some of those issues in a moment. The International Agency for Research on Cancer says that there will be 16,000 eventual deaths from Chernobyl. The Belarus Academy of Sciences says that there's been already 93,000 deaths and 270,000 cancers. The Ukrainian National Commission has another figure. The Russian Academy of Sciences says that there have been 60,000 deaths in Russia and 140,000 deaths in the Ukraine and Belarus. The Belarus Academy of Sciences, we talked about a moment ago, and the Ukrainian National Commission says 500,000 deaths so far. This is quite a range, from talking about 56 deaths to 500,000 deaths. So what are we to believe about this? And why the disparity in this? Well, part of it is that it's very hard to collect this information. When we look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how much radiation was there in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how did it occur as compared to Chernobyl and Fukushima? I still can't get the correct pronunciation. Well, The bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was a one-time dose of radiation. The bomb was exploded about 1,000 feet in the air. And I always get this question. Well, look, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki built back up and they're fine, you know, so why should we be worried about this? That's because there was no fallout. There was no long-term radioactive nuclides that came with that bomb, at least very little. There was black rain, but we have no idea how much radiation was in that. It wasn't a lot. So it was like a one-time X-ray that those people got. And the heat and fire killed 100,000, and now 100,000 more plus have died since then. And we're still seeing, 65 years later, new tumors coming in that population. And now increased heart disease and stroke, other illnesses that are connected to this as well. 65 years we've been watching that. What do you think that study has cost? The study didn't start until about 3 years after the bomb. So it took a lot of work to reconstruct how much radiation those people got. In 1988, okay, the last figure I could find, there had been $2.5 billion spent on that study alone. And I'm sure by now it's probably $5 billion that's been spent, you know, given inflation and continued looking at this. It's a lot of money for that study, which was a one-time dose of radiation that a populace received. Ought to be pretty easy to look at, you know. Well, now, here we are in Fukushima and in Chernobyl, looking at long-lived radiation, because those plants blew up, and they blew out cesium, strontium-90, iodine, that last for a long time in the environment, for literally hundreds of years. And we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. And so that's going to be very hard to study, especially when you suppress that information, as we've done in Chernobyl, and I believe is happening as well in Fukushima. We'll talk about that too. So what else do we know about low-dose radiation? Because this is the big thing that the nuclear industry says. You have background radiation, you get medical radiation, and now this is just a little bit more that we add to it. That's not a big deal, all right? So what do we really know about low-dose radiation? Dr. Alice Stewart, whom you see pictured here, a famous British physician, studied the effects of low-dose radiation on fetuses in utero when you were in the uterus. And she looked at X-ray studies in England and looked at the outcome of those fetuses and found that one X-ray of a fetus in utero increased that child's chances of getting leukemia by 2 times. One X-ray. Now, when I started practice in 1973, it was very common in my obstetrical practice to do a procedure called X-ray pelvimetry. When we come in labor, we would do 2 or 3 X-rays of her pelvis. Mary, my partner, remembers doing those, I'm sure, as a radiology tech. Absolutely worthless procedure. Told us nothing about whether the baby would be delivered vaginally. And yet we did them fairly routinely. Fair dose of radiation to the fetus there, all right? And then Dr. Stewart came along and said, boy, this is not such a good idea, because that baby that you've just X-rayed now has 2 times the chance of getting leukemia, all right? That's low-dose radiation. Those studies have been replicated, and now we don't X-ray babies in utero anymore unless we absolutely have to, all right? And this has been the history of medical radiation, decreasing dose throughout time. Madame Curie, who did a lot of the original work with X-rays, Madame Curie used to carry around a test tube full of radioactive material and kept it in her desk because she liked the glow of it. All right. She died in her 60s, early 60s, of aplastic anemia, almost certainly from that radiation exposure. Her daughter died even younger, in her 50s, of leukemia. Her husband, unfortunately, died when a carriage rolled over his head and crushed his head as he stepped out the front door of their house. But anyway, another little history point there. So anyway, low-dose radiation is not good for you. There is no safe dose of radiation. And so when you hear this from the industry, realize that it's simply not true. It's a matter of how much risk you want to take with this. Now, you can do something about the radiation that's background radiation. You test your basement and you get rid of the radon, all right? You can choose not to fly if you wish. Small doses of radiation, but it increases your background radiation dose that you get every year. So you can do things about that. You can do things about medical radiation. You can talk to your doctor and say, is this procedure absolutely necessary? Do I have to have another CAT scan? Because chances are, most of the time, that's not the case. We over-radiate people in medicine all the time. But you don't have a choice. When the nuclear industry releases radiation, as it does all along the fuel cycle, you're going to get that radiation as you have done from nuclear testing and as you're doing now from Chernobyl and Fukushima. Other low-dose effects of X-rays. Dental X-rays early in pregnancy. Study in the JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, not too long ago, showed that dental X-rays of women who were early in their pregnancy, many of the women didn't even know they were pregnant. They had lap shields on, but not thyroid shields, and they had dental X-rays. And lo and behold, they had statistically lower birth weights infants than infants who were not X-rayed in this way. The infants didn't get X-rayed directly, the mothers did. And we think that's because the mother's thyroid got irradiated with just those dental X-rays, and that affected the growth of the fetus. And this happened very early in pregnancy. So again, there is no free lunch here. We're worried about several isotopes when we look at the fallout from the nuclear power industry, the nuclear industrial complex. Iodine-131. And again, you've all read things about, oh, this isn't so bad, it goes away very quickly, you know, it's in the milk, but just keep the milk on the shelf for a while and everything will be okay. Make it into cheese and then the iodine will disappear. So it has a half-life of 8 days. Multiply that times 10. And that's the length of time we have to worry about. So 80 to 90 days is the time it takes for that iodine to disappear from the environment. And it's continuing to come out of that plant, so it continues to cycle on. It's picked up by the cows, gets in the milk, etc. Strontium-90 has a half-life of 29 years. It gets in your bone, in your teeth. And we found this out with nuclear testing because we tested children's teeth back in the 60s when we were doing nuclear testing, and that radiation wafted across the United States and went around the world. And that radiation we found in children's teeth. We ground them up and tested for strontium-90, which doesn't occur normally in the environment. And so that led to the above-ground test ban treaty that put testing underground, which was a fortunate thing. We wish it would have stopped totally at that time. And it stays in your teeth and your bones and continues to irradiate those areas, causing bone cancers. Cesium-137 gets in the muscle and soft tissue. It gets in your eyes, produces cataracts, gets in muscle. Muscle's the main place that it goes. Iodine goes to the thyroid gland. The younger you are, the bigger dose you get to your thyroid gland, causing tumors, as we've seen in Chernobyl subsequently. Plutonium-239, which again doesn't occur naturally in nature, comes from nuclear power plants and nuclear testing, and it gets in the lungs, kidney, causes kidney damage, kidney failure, gets absorbed through the lungs into the bloodstream and goes to all of your organs, and causes lung cancer if it lodges in the lungs and stays there. And it doesn't go away. So again, you multiply these numbers times 10, and that's the length of time you have to worry about this stuff deteriorating. So you ingest plutonium, then you're cremated, and it gets cycled back into the environment, or it gets in animals and gets cycled back into the environment, as does cesium, etc. It goes around and goes around and goes around. It's truly the forever pollution. And it does that through the food cycle. It gets into the soil, comes up through the plants that grow, gets in the grass, for example, in the pastures. The cows eat it. It gets in the cows' meat and in the milk. And of course, we're at the top of the food chain. And so it comes up to us and comes up to us and comes up to us over and over again. It is the forever pollution. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but is our food tested for?
So the question is our food tested for radiation? They're doing more of that now, but not routinely, yeah. And there's some radiation in everything that we eat. Some of it came from nuclear testing, some of it came from Chernobyl, some of it is now coming from Fukushima. They're doing lots more testing, of course, of the food coming from Japan. And that's why, you know, China has blocked shipments of food from Japan. I mean, there's a terrible economic toll on Japan. But I'm not aware that food here is routinely tested unless it's in these situations, yeah. Well, this stuff leaks out all along the fuel cycle. It's not just from nuclear weapons and not just the end of the cycle. We mine uranium, we produce tailings, we'll look at that. We go through the enriching of uranium, We go through conversion to fuel, put it in reactors. We make bombs out of it, and so nuclear weapons are exploded around the world and have been, lots of them. And then it comes into storage. Plutonium's taken out of it, reprocessed. One of the plants in Japan is burning MOX fuel, which has plutonium in it as well, rather than just uranium. And then we don't know what to do with it at the end. We don't know where to store it. We have no way, and the French have no way, the Norwegians have no way. Nobody knows where to put this stuff because we have to keep it safe from the environment for thousands of years. An impossible task. There's no way that you can guarantee that you put that somewhere, it's going to stay out in the environment for thousands of years. These are tailings, and this is in the Rio Puerco area in Arizona. And these tailings produce big piles like that that release radon into the atmosphere that's breathed by people. And the animals get in here and they get the radiation in them. So it spreads through the environment. And this is ground up rock that the uranium is taken out of when we produce uranium. Huge amounts of this in the world. And we don't know how to cover these up. We don't know what to do about it. And it's going to be there for thousands of years. We also know from testing nuclear weapons and from the explosions of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki about radiation. And this is a picture of the effects in Hiroshima after the bomb. Many people were just disappeared. Your body's mostly water, and so there's enough heat that you just disappear. Some people were left as charred remains. Other people, their skin was falling off. I'm sure you've seen some of the movies, the Habakushu and the horrible stories. And this didn't just happen there. It also happened in Kishtim in Russia, which we'll look at in a moment. So we know about acute radiation poisoning. We know about the long-term effects of this. We've learned a lot about it. We've also known about it through nuclear testing. We've set off over 1,000 nuclear weapons in the world above the ground. And that radiation has gone worldwide, and it's still in the environment today. This is a test, Baker test, in the South Pacific that we set off. And that radiation from that test went over the island of Rongelap, which was a small island, and the children were out. The radiation was taken up in that plume that went up, and as opposed to Hiroshima, where the bomb was exploded high in the air and it didn't produce any fallout, these bombs produced a lot of fallout that went up into the air. Coral, ground up coral, fish, everything in it were blown up and taken up. And it wafted over Rongelap, and the children were out playing in this. They thought it was snow coming down, because they'd never seen snow, of course. This white stuff coming down, and it was radioactive coral coming down. And so many of them got cancer afterwards, like this young man who's having his thyroid checked at Bethesda. Nice of us to do, to bring him to Bethesda and check his thyroid. And unfortunately, a year later, he died of leukemia. So these are the deaths that we have caused. We didn't just do it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We have killed people around the world through our nuclear testing program. And we continue to do that today because these nuclides are still in the environment and they are still killing people today. And what can we do about this? Well, you read about remediation of the land. They're talking a lot about that around Chernobyl and Belarus. Well, we can put potassium on the soil, fertilizers that soak up the cesium, keeps the cesium from coming up into the plants, etc. So this is the Bikini Atoll. You can see here the Bikini Island, and the guy's holding a pumpkin down here on the left, and he's got a lead-lined glove on. And this is like, what, 50 years after the bomb was exploded in the Bikini Atoll, the bomb that you just saw there. And so it deposited a lot of cesium in the ground there. They stripped off 14 inches of topsoil. They replaced it, and then they grew pumpkins in the area that they had done this to try and get the radiation, just like they've done around Chernobyl, huge areas that they've stripped off the topsoil, okay? And then they grew this pumpkin, and you can see on the spectrophotometer there, the spike, that's cesium in the pumpkin 50 years later. And you can see what happened to the pumpkin. It doesn't look so good, does it? It wouldn't make a very good jack-o'-lantern. And that's exactly the situation that we're seeing around Chernobyl today. A report that just came out a year ago said that, gosh, something strange is happening here because the cesium, we predicted that it would decrease in the soil around Chernobyl, and it hasn't. Something's wrong. The unknowns are always greater than the knowns in this thing. We don't know why the cesium isn't going away in the soil around Chernobyl. It may be that new cesium is being blown up and deposited in the area. It may be that plants are sucking it up and bringing it up into the soil. We just don't know. And this is the situation we're going to experience in Japan. And it's going to go on, just like it is in Chernobyl, for hundreds of years. Well, we know about other accidents. This is Kishtim in Russia. It's out in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. And these were tanks that they had high-level nuclear waste. This happens to be tanks in Hanford up in our country, in Washington here. And in these tanks, this high-level nuclear waste produces hydrogen. So you have to blow it off, you have to keep the stuff cool. So the cooling system in one of these tanks in Kishtim in 1957 broke down. And so the water evaporated, the stuff concentrated, and it blew the lid right off this tank. And it then distributed radiation for about 800 kilometers, an area of 350 square miles, is totally off limits to human habitation today. People in those villages had their skin peeling off, much like the effect of the folks in Hiroshima with acute radiation effects, died of acute radiation poisoning. The Russian government didn't even tell them what was happening. They went in, they bulldozed down villages, they moved people out of the area, they hospitalized people, a lot of people died, and yet they weren't even told that this was radiation poisoning. And the government kept it from people, and it was only in the 60s that this was discovered. But you know what? The CIA knew about this because they had overflights over the area, and they watched this happening. And CIA records knew that this was happening, and they didn't tell us either what was going on. This is the secrecy that I've talked about here. And it occurred all through the nuclear weapons time. You know, they used to set off weapons in Nevada. And then the Kodak Corporation found in Rochester, New York, that their film was getting fogged when the radiation would come across the country and rainstorms would rain down and get on their film. And so then the Department of Defense started telling the Kodak Corporation, we're going to explode a weapon now, you better take care of your film. And they put it in lead-lined safes out there. But they didn't tell me as a child in Iowa that this radiation was coming over and I was going to get it in my thyroid and in the soil and in the meat and whatnot in Iowa, which was one of the more heavily irradiated areas in the country. We didn't find that out until the late 80s or 90s when these health maps were brought forth. The government knew about it, but had kept it secret all these years. This is the secrecy. This is the cover-up that has gone on through time with this. So, yeah.
Why in Iowa? Iowa is one of the heavily irradiated areas?
I think it's because, why in Iowa, you're asking, yeah.
Yes.
This is, you know, the vagaries of where wind patterns go, and maybe there were rainstorms, you know, those sorts of things happen that alter where the radiation goes. And so there can be very hot areas, cooler areas, and it can change from day to day.
Yeah. Thank you.
I say that because I'm from Iowa. That's really why I say this, yeah. So, yeah, anyway. All right. So as you drive through the area around Kishtim where this happened now, and I was there in the early 90s, you drive through this area and you look at the woods and here's a sign that says, danger, don't come into these woods. This is too radioactive to be in, okay? Unfortunately, the animals have not learned to read Russian yet, and so they don't know not to go in the woods, okay? But this whole area is off limits to human habitation, and yet animals go in the area. And then you go along a little further and you see fields where they're growing crops. And I said, how can you grow crops here when the woods around are contaminated? Isn't this land contaminated? Oh yeah, of course it is. Well, we need the food. Well, what do? Well, we grow the crops, and we take the crops from this area, and we ship them to areas that don't have radiation, and we mix those crops together, and then we feed them to the animals and your children and the people, all right? And the same thing's happening in Belarus and in the Ukraine today, and who knows what will happen in Japan, okay? But this is the nature of what happens after these catastrophic accidents. This is reality. Well, the cesium was deposited in Ukraine, in Belarus. In fact, a lot of it came in Belarus. And it acutely irradiated people in the plant, and there were immediately 29 deaths and 56 deaths from acute radiation poisoning. A month after Chernobyl, I went to Germany and to East and West Germany, and that was before the fall of the wall. And I did a speaking tour, and it was in Marburg, which is a town much like Madison, Wisconsin, a university town. After my lecture on radiation, The mayor of Marburg came up to me and introduced himself, and he said, he was frantic, and he said, tell me, what should I tell my population? What should I tell people about the effects of the radiation? He said, you know, we have counties in Germany where the cows are out in the fields grazing. In my county, we've told people to keep the cows in and feed them, you know, stored food so they don't get radiation in the milk. He said, we've got areas where we'll be out and we're measuring the radiation in the ground and there isn't much, and then we come across a puddle on the sidewalk and there's a huge amount of radiation in that puddle because it rained and the rain concentrates the radiation in the puddle, all right? I was in Washington, D.C. the other day, and I was coming out of the subway, and there was a guy in front of me with his young daughter, and it was raining, and there was water there, and she's in her red boots, and she's just splashing like this in the puddles, okay? Who splashes in puddles? Little kids, don't they, all right? And so here you have high radiation in these puddles, and, you know, the kids are playing in it. And yeah, now in Japan, you got the situation where they're raising the safe level of radiation for kids there, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So people died at Chernobyl of acute radiation poisoning. So then I went from there, from East and West Germany. In West Germany, at least they were talking about this stuff and trying to figure out what to do. But like the mayor of Marburg, who didn't know what to do, and then he went on to say, he said, I get different answers from my medical doctors, from my radiation biologists, from my engineers, my radiation physicists. They tell me everything's okay. You know, they eat this stuff every morning for breakfast. And it's fine. He said, what should I tell people? What would you tell them? And I'm sure there are mayors in Japan who are dealing with this very same situation today, that they have no idea and they're not getting straight information from the government or from TEPCO or anybody there about what to tell their people. Okay. Well, this gentleman was an engineer who was, and then I went to Moscow and I visited hospital number 6 where these radiation victims were being treated. And this gentleman was an engineer. He was in the floor below the reactor when it blew up, and he came up into the reactor room and helped put out the fires there. And he had radiation burns up his legs because the radiation wafted up the legs and gave him beta radiation burns on his legs. He's bronze in color because he's having liver failure. His white count was down to 0 here because so much radiation destroyed his bone marrow system to produce white cells. He died. He's bald, lost all his hair because the hair reproduces rapidly, and so you lose that tissue that reproduces rapidly with the radiation poisoning. And he was in this little cubicle of room, no family, nobody around. It was just pathetic. And you know, this is what happened. And there were 600,000 to 800,000 liquidators who came into Chernobyl after this and helped clean up. Here's a life tent, and this is a sterile environment, a fireman with burns on his buttocks, and this gentleman also died. Dr. Robert Gale went over there and did bone marrow transplants on some of these people. And at a conference I went to in 1988, 2 years after this, in Kiev, and then we went out to Chernobyl, they said that the people who had the bone marrow transplants did worse than the people who didn't have them. So again, how little we know, and I read an article the other day that a doctor in Japan was saying we should take bone marrow from these workers who are in these plants ahead of time so that we can give them, we have no idea if that's going to work or what it's going to do, you know. We're all walking in the dark here. So these liquidators came in, volunteers. You know, 100,000 were from the military. Somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 were other people in society who came in. And they went around and they would go to places, and you watch movies of these, and they'll run into the area, take a shovel full of stuff, and take it away. They were allowed in the area for 10 minutes, and then they were rotated out. And I talked to a gentleman the other day who's at my university, and he's a radiation physicist, and he worked in Chernobyl, and his job was to go around and find where the hot spots were, and then tell the workers, you can be here for 10 minutes, you can be here for 15 minutes, and the same thing's happening in Japan today. And then they measured these radiation on these people, all these workers. You can see that some of them have respirators on. Most of them wore paper masks, which he said they didn't wear. The conscripts would be sleeping in the grass around Chernobyl. They didn't wear their masks. They'd be smoking and whatnot. And he said they all had radiation badges, but that told nothing about the internal dose of radiation that they got, because they inhaled the iodine, the cesium, strontium-90, plutonium in the area. They kept records of at least the external doses. And he said, I've been back to my institute in Kiev, and he said, I've tried to find these records, and they're gone. they're gone. All right. Where did they go? I said, well, he said, I don't know. They were either taken to Moscow after the fall of the wall and buried there, buried in files somewhere, or they were destroyed. He said, I don't know. And I said, well, you're a radiation expert. You knew how to do this stuff. And he incidentally moved his family out of Kiev right away when this happened and gave them iodine too. The rest of the people didn't get that right away. But anyway, I said, you're an expert in this. How much radiation did you get? He said, I have no idea. I have no idea. So this is, again, part of the cover-up, part of the secrecy, part of the minimization of this, and part of the reason that we will never know with any accuracy how many people died, how many illnesses are caused by this in this population, because this information is literally buried. Why? Well, interesting question, and I think there are multiple answers to that. The area around Chernobyl was so radioactive that they had to strip all the soil off. Villages where people were moved out, some people, older people, have moved in, but most people are gone. Forest, this whole area was forested, a few trees that were left, they cut down everything else, and they graded off all the soil in this area and buried it in trenches and replaced it with sand from the Dnieper River. So when I was there 2 years after the plant went up, I saw men out bulldozing this dirt up, you know, highly radioactive dirt. Not any respirators at all, okay, they're just in regular clothes. And I said to my guide, I said, how are you monitoring these people? Well, they all wear radiation badges. Says nothing about how much internal radiation you get, all right? And I said, really, where's your badge? And he looks like this, and he says, oh, I guess I left it at home in my other coat today. Well, you know, my guess is nobody was being monitored there, all right? And today in Fukushima, there was an article about 3 days ago in the paper saying, in the Guardian, saying that the workers there are complaining because their radiation doses are not being accurately monitored and not being accurately recorded. Because if it's recorded and they have a health problem later on, then they can get compensation for it. And that's exactly what happened in Russia. There were memos that have now come out saying specifically, unless somebody has acute radiation poisoning, there's to be no record that their illness is connected to radiation at all. Secrecy, cover-up, minimization, hallmarks of the nuclear industrial complex that continue today. Well, here I am standing in front of the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus was built rapidly. They poured boron and sand on the explosion to quell the radiation, and we owe a lot to these liquidators because this could have been much worse if they hadn't done that and risked their lives, and many of them we believe have died now because of this. And I think it's important to remember that today, the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, that these people gave their lives for you and I. Well, anyway, still radioactive standing here in the sarcophagus. The cement in it is cracking. There are picture window-sized areas in the cement where the radiation's coming out of. Water goes in, animals go in, etc. So they're going to build a new sarcophagus over this. And this is the plan for this. It's steel bridges that they build on one end of it, and they slide them over the old sarcophagus and then weld them together, and then they'll dismantle the old sarcophagus. All right, that's the plan. A French company is doing this. Well, this is going to cost, estimated, $1.1 billion to do, all right? And so they're asking the world, the Ukraine is, for contributions to this, because Ukraine's been hit very hard, as Belarus, economically. In the initial years after Chernobyl, 1/6 of the Ukrainian budget went to Chernobyl. In 1991, 22% of the Belarus budget, national budget, went to Chernobyl, all right? It's now in both countries somewhere between 5 and 7% of their national budgets go to the effects of Chernobyl. Devastating on the national budget. Imagine if that were happening here, what the Tea Party would do with that, you know. Be a little upset about it, I suspect. So anyway, the Ukraine is asking for donations from the world to build this sarcophagus for $1.1 billion. They've now raised $800 million and are having trouble raising the rest. All right. The project is already 3 years behind schedule. And this sarcophagus is scheduled to last for 100 years. The previous one was supposed to last 10 years. It's now 25 years out. Who's going to build the next one 100 years from now? What Ukrainian government's even going to be around 100 years from now? How are we going to keep this out of the environment? managing the unmanageable. This is the cost of that. So really, what we're talking about here is an industry that in this third category of radiation, which is radiation that leaks out all along the fuel cycle, is produced by nuclear weapons going off around the world and stays in the environment, is produced by catastrophic releases from Fukushima, Chernobyl, Kishtim, and others that have come very, very close to this happening as well, is produced by releases from nuclear power plants where near accidents happen and they just release the steam into the environment just like they've done in Fukushima, and they're allowed to do that, emergency releases. But of course, no harm to human health. All right. So as this says, he's grown a foot since I last saw him, which is indeed what they're trying to tell us. You know, it's okay, it's healthy, it's not going to hurt you. You have to make up your own mind. Natural disasters have a beginning, a middle, and an end, like a hurricane. We tell people to get out of the area, they evacuate. Some people stay, choose to stay. Some people can't evacuate because they're in a nursing home, they're in prison, etc. And then it ends and we rebuild. Not so with radiation. Radiation contaminates, it befouls, it penetrates and pollutes. It's silent and unseen. You can't feel it, smell it, know it's there. You don't know how much your kids are getting. You know that, yeah, it's you know, in Fukushima, the allowable level for children is 1 millisievert, okay, per year. Now, because they don't want to move people out of the area, they've raised that to 20 millisieverts for children, the most vulnerable of our population, children. And 20 millisieverts is the level that previously we've allowed for nuclear workers in a year. We've now raised that in Japan to 250 millisieverts, which used to be it's the emergency level. If you're an emergency worker, you can go in and get that dose before you have to be moved out of the area. Well, here are these children now. We're raising this level suddenly to 20 millisieverts, which was the level we agreed on before, which would be the yearly level for nuclear workers. How would you feel if your child were now being exposed to this and your government were saying, it's okay, all right? You know, it's a little bit like being in a ball game and you're in the 7th inning and you're the losing team and you're kind of irritated about the fact you're losing, and you say, we're going to change the rules of the game here. You know, we're going to change the foul lines. We're going to change the rules of play here because we're not winning and we want to win. Except this is not a game, all right? This is people's lives that we're playing with, and we're never going to know the end of this experiment because we're not going to be able to watch these people. You know, think about the cost of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, billions of dollars to watch that experiment. We are putting people in an experiment here, a poisonous, cruel experiment that we're not going to know the end of, and is going to go on for years and years and years. And in my opinion, this is unconscionable. It's unconscionable. And yet that's what the nuclear industrial complex is doing to us.
If people want to take action, there is an international petition going on right now to ask the Japanese government to not do that with the children.
Thank you very much, Dave. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. Yeah. The nuclear industrial complex, its nuclear weapons and nuclear power go hand in hand. The peaceful atom was designed by Eisenhower to promote the peaceful use of the atom. We were supposed to have nuclear energy that was too cheap to meter. Think about the cost of nuclear energy. I mentioned price. You know, if we add in all of this stuff, what the Ukraine has paid, what Belarus has paid, what we've all paid for illness from the bombing, from this accident in Japan, etc. Nuclear power is so expensive. It's just unbelievably expensive, in addition to killing people. And then proliferation of nuclear weapons. We're seeing that in Iran. Imagine what it's going to be like when not 9 countries have nuclear weapons, but 40 countries have nuclear weapons. And if we think we don't like Fukushima or Chernobyl, think what's going to happen when the next nuclear weapon goes off in Washington or San Francisco or London. Because, you know, the terrorists talking about, the article in the paper today said that, you know, one of the head terrorists who planned 9/11 said that if we kill Osama bin Laden, they're going to set off a nuclear weapon in a major city. You know, it's a plan. So anyway, you know, this is the reality of your lives and the lives for your children. As Einstein said the splitting of the atom has changed everything save our mode of thinking. Thus, we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. And that's nuclear weapons, nuclear power. So what do we have to do? Well, I really believe we have to look ahead. And we have to get rid of nuclear weapons. We have to abolish nuclear weapons, and we need to do it quickly. You know, Obama has talked about it and started us down that road. We've gotten rid of 25,000 nuclear weapons, but we still have 25,000 nuclear weapons left in the world. And many of them still on hair trigger alert that they can go off. You know, Obama walks around, the guy walks around with a suitcase still with him that he can set those weapons off in 12 minutes anywhere in the world. Unconscionable that one man should have the right to do that and the power to do that to the world. And we could talk about nuclear weapons and limited nuclear war if you'd like. So we have to stop that. We can prevent nuclear war, and we have to do that. And then we have to phase out nuclear power. There's no way that we can make nuclear power safe. There's no way that we can guarantee that other accidents won't happen. There are 23 reactors in this country out of 104 that are the same design as the reactors in Fukushima. And what's going to happen in Fukushima when the next hurricane hits there? The earliest hurricane there was, I think, May 14th or May 24th, something like that, 2 or 3 years ago. And hurricane season's coming up now, and you've got now these open reactors with fuel pools. They can't even get into the things because the radiation is so high. And imagine what's going to happen if a hurricane hits that area, and it's going to blow inland, because it's not going to blow the radiation out, it's going to blow inland. And what are they going to put big tarps over these things? What an unbelievable disaster we're looking at, and it's not over. So I believe that it's all of our responsibility to work very hard on these issues, to educate ourselves, and then to talk to our neighbors, our friends, to educate them, to talk to our politicians, and again, to work for these two things. Ending nuclear power, we need to learn to generate energy that is truly green, truly renewable. And the first thing we need to do is conservation and better use of the electricity that we do now. We could save 30% of the electricity that we use just by those measures alone. And by 2020, if we did that, that would obviate the need for 100 new nuclear power plants. So that's the simplest solution. And then we need to move to solar, wind, combinations of these things that are truly green and renewable. This is a very, very serious issue, and most people in your generation are sound asleep about this. And I rode with a young engineering student today on the plane from Ann Arbor, and she was talking about this, and she said most of my generation know nothing about this and are not concerned about it at all. I truly believe as a physician that the issues of the nuclear industrial complex and the issues of climate change are the two biggest things that we have to face as human beings. And so I invite all of your activity, and I certainly applaud Sarah and Dave and you who've been educating people about, and other people in the audience as well, who've been working on this, and I hope all of you will join us in this process, because it's only through our activity that we're going to change the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Patterson. Any questions?
My question is regarding the workers that will be going into Fukushima. Obviously, a lot of the work needs to be human-based, because we can use technology and different machinery, but a lot of the search and rescue stuff needs to be by humans. So I'm just wondering, what do you think that they're preparing the workers that are going in, and can there be any sort of compensation, any incentives for people to do that type of work, because it's very heroic. We know the effects of Chernobyl. We know what radiation does to human beings, but at what cost, and for the type of work that needs to be done, is there any trade-off?
Right. So my understanding is that they are paying these workers more, and they're actually asking for workers to come from other countries to come in to work as well, because many of these workers are going to reach their radiation limits very quickly. working in an area for a half an hour, as you say, very short times. And so then you have to have new workers rotating into the area. And of course that makes the work very difficult because you got somebody who's trained to do this and now you have a new person coming in a half an hour later to do the same thing. It's a real headache, and I honestly believe that I've read that many of these workers feel that they are going to die from this, and that may ultimately be the case. And whether we'll know with any accuracy or not, just like watching the Chernobyl liquidators. So these are very brave people, and I've said perhaps the head of TEPCO should volunteer to go in and do some of this work, rather than, anyway. At least he's gotten his salary cut in half, I understand. And so I don't know that I have a good answer other than these people are going to suffer for this. And if Chernobyl, which was one plant, took 600,000 to 800,000 people to do this, what's going to happen in Japan here, where we've got 4 plants in a row like this? And if you've seen the pictures, and Dave, maybe you're going to show some of those pictures of the destruction of these plants. I mean, I can't imagine going in there and trying to do this. Yeah.
Please come to the mic.
One of the things that I think separates Chernobyl from Fukushima is the containment vessels that are surrounding the Fukushima plants. Can you give us a quick synopsis of the current state of affairs in Fukushima and your projection for what is eventually going to be required?
Sure.
Do you believe another sarcophagus is going to need?
Are you going to talk about this? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to maybe let Dave address that. Is that all right? Or do you want me to
do the presentation?
Yeah, you'll be doing it. Yeah. Okay. So Dave will be addressing that issue a bit more, if that's all right with you. Yeah.
Dr. Patterson, do you have any suggestions about shopping at the grocery store and the precautions that we might need to take, maybe specifically here in the Chicago area?
So the question is, do I have any suggestions about shopping in the grocery store, and particularly in the Chicago area? I guess we have to rely on the government a bit here to test foods. And, I think there have been the stoppage of shipments from this area that's heavily irradiated. And obviously other countries are concerned about this as well. China, which has blocked the import of most Japanese products, food products, I think. And so I guess we really have to rely on that. I think the amounts of radiation that you're going to get in any particular food products are probably going to be pretty low. And so I'm not sure that I would adjust my eating habits at this point in time. Could change because we may see a fuel pool catch fire and this radiation be lofted. And in terms of what they have told us about how much radiation's come out of this, just yesterday the Japanese Regulatory Commission came out and said that they lied about how much radiation was coming out of this plant. And instead of, I don't recall the numbers, but instead of like 1 terabecquerel an hour or a day, it was like 150 terabecquerels, and they didn't want to panic people, and so they just lied about it. Well, are they telling the truth now? This is part of the cover-up and whatnot that makes it very hard for the public to have confidence in what they're being told about this. And again, people in this country, I have calls from all over the country. I had a call from somebody in New York who has goats and asking what did she do about the radiation. They had the goat milk tested and it's got strontium-90 in it and strontium-87. And strontium-87 has a very short half-life, strontium-90 has a longer half-life. So the question is this left over from nuclear testing? Is it left over from Chernobyl? Or is it new from Fukushima? So these are, I think, things that we just don't know for sure. Yeah.
Living in Illinois, where we have so many nuclear power plants, what is it, I want to ask you as a physician, what is it that we can do if there's a nuclear accident in this area? How can I protect myself and my family?
Sure. So the question is, if there's a nuclear accident, how can you protect yourself in this area? A lot of nuclear power plants in Illinois, Wisconsin, 25% of our electricity comes from nuclear power. So there are basically 3 principles. One is iodine immediately. and iodine should be taken, and especially children and pregnant women and lactating women should take iodine, preferably an hour before they're exposed to the iodine, but even a day or two later helps block the uptake of radioactive iodine into the thyroid gland. Iodine, staying indoors, does help, there's no question about it. And then evacuation is the third thing. So those three things are the principles behind what to do in the case of an event like this. We had a press conference today, and you can go to our website, which is psr.org, and we just put up a thing that shows every nuclear power plant in the United States, and you can click on where you live, put in your zip code, and see how close you are to the nuclear power plant, see how many people within a 50-mile radius, which is what we've told U.S. people to leave around the Japan plant, even though the Japanese government hasn't done that, and see that in many places like New York City, South Miami, Florida, this would be an absolute impossibility. New York City, if you had a 50-mile radius from the nearest nuclear power plant to New York City, you're talking about 17 million people you're going to have to evacuate. Well, imagine doing that in the middle of a snowstorm or in the middle of a big rainstorm, or, you know, which is when these accidents are likely to happen, okay? It's a physical impossibility, and that's what we're maintaining, and that's why we maintain that many of these plants should be certainly examined very closely and probably shut down fairly soon because of this risk. So go to our website and you can find this information. Yeah. But iodine, oh, so the mayor of South Miami tried to find out from his county. There's one center in his county that's going to distribute the iodine, so you have to go to that center to get the iodine. Imagine the traffic jam that's going to be around that, all right? The wind, when he wrote this, he said the wind's blowing 7 miles an hour, and so it would take 3 hours from the radiation from that plant to get to my house, all right? He has a young daughter. Can I get to the plant in that time, the distribution center? And then he tried to get the county to tell him how many doses of iodine they had to pass out, and they wouldn't tell him. Probably because they don't have a lot. Okay. So this is the kind of ludicrous nature of, you know, the nuclear industrial complex and what they're doing.
Jeff, hello again. I'm Andy Davis.
Okay.
Jeff and I traveled.
Andy was in hospital number 6 with me taking these in Russia.
I'm a internal medicine public health physician at the University of Chicago, and I have a degree in environmental health from the University of Illinois.
Great to see you again.
And great to see you. And the question I have that I struggle with as a public health physician is looking at the calculations of risk by various energy sources. So if you look at oil, coal, and natural gas, there are estimates of one way of doing it is deaths per terawatt hour.
Yep.
And for the fossil fuels, the death rates are, when you talk about the whole life cycle of coal and the particulate matter it puts into the air, we may be talking 160 deaths per terawatt hour, where nuclear, even allowing for the underestimation by the nuclear industrial complex, is less than 1 per terawatt hour. And fossil fuels are roughly about 70% worldwide and perhaps 6% for nuclear energy. So I agree nuclear energy needs a lot of monitoring, but what troubles me is the coal power plants in Pilsen or trying to deal with fossil fuels and what I see as a more immediate threat to us than the radiation.
Right.
If you could comment on that.
Sure. So this is a good question, and a very valid question that comes up all the time. I look at this as a choice between two bad things, all right? And just because one thing is bad doesn't mean we have to move to the other thing. So people talk about, well, if we move away from nuclear, then we're going to burn more coal and do more of that. No, we have to move to, again, conservation, efficiency, and other means. And if we put the same amount of money into solar and hydro and wind that we put into the nuclear industry through guaranteed loans, et cetera, we could probably easily move away from these things. I liken this to saying to an alcoholic, well, you got a problem with alcohol and you're using a lot of alcohol and we got to get you to stop that, so we're going to put you on cocaine instead, okay? It's kind of a false choice here. These are both bad things and both things that we have to move away from. That's my answer to that.
Jeff, of all the scary slides that you showed, it was actually the slide of the introduction of radiation into our food supply that frightened me the most, because I'm the mother of a 12-year-old, and I enjoy cooking, and we're foodies, but in the last 6 or 7 years, I've decided to only buy organic for her as much as I can. But now I'm like, is her food radiated? So, what can I do to protect her? And so I guess that forms the basis of my question, which is, you talked a lot about cancer rates and how there's probably a lot of lack of information and possible cover-up around Chernobyl. And who knows what will happen in Japan. But in the U.S., we have pretty good cancer records. So you talked about radiation in our food supply, and in Iowa when you were growing up, and then all these above-ground tests. Has there been a blip in cancer rates that's attributable to the kind of radiation from the nuclear industrial complex that you talk about, or is it just in the U.S. where we have pretty good cancer records, or is it too hard to tease out?
Probably Andy could answer that better than I can, but I guess my answer to that is that, when we look at populations, it's pretty hard to tease out which cancers are caused by the radiation and which are not. And how do you know that? I think about a cardiologist friend of mine that I just talked to recently, and we were talking about this, and he's about my age. And he said, it's very interesting. He's traveled to Russia with me too. And he said, when I was a kid, I had 400 rads to my tonsils because I had chronic tonsillitis, all right? And then I've been a cardiologist, and I wear a radiation badge. And he said, I went in and tried to find out what my total dose was for my lifetime, all right? And he said I couldn't find out. I could find out for my current radiation badge, but the records from previous ones when I was at another hospital and the hospital changed hands are gone. And he said, so I have no idea what my total medical radiation dose is. And so I think this is part of the dilemma in, dose reconstruction and where we're at with this, I guess would be my answer. I don't think we know the answer to your question. No. I think we can say that we know that if we give this dose of radiation to a population, this is how many cancers we're going to produce. We're going to take one more quick question, then we're going to stop so Dave can talk. Yeah.
I read Japanese article about children moved from Fukushima prefecture and transferred another school, like elementary school, having difficult to make new friends in new school. Because I think so elementary school student, I don't think elementary school students don't know about nuclear, so I think they feel fear about new student from Fukushima prefecture. So my question is, how they should educate they don't have to feel fear. Yeah.
Right. So the issue is when people get irradiated, and children are particularly cruel in this area, I guess. There's ostracizing that goes on, and the Habakashu experienced this in Japan. People in Russia experience this, and there are interesting ways this is happening in Japan now. There are hotels in Tokyo that will not rent rooms to people from the area of Fukushima because they're concerned that these people are going to bring radiation into the room and contaminate the beds and the things, and their insurance won't pay to remediate the rooms if that happens. And then there are these social stigmas that go on with this. How do we educate people about this? I think we have to be very open about the effects of this, and that these people are not going to make you sick. That they are may suffer from this. And I think that's the only way we can do it, the best way we can do it. Yeah. It's a very real thing, and it's not just in Japan. But I can't imagine what the psychological effects in Japan are going to be, because Japan had the fear of radiation seared into its collective psyche with the bombs going on, and now this is like deja vu, times 1,000 here. And the psychological effects, I'm sure that you can speak more to this, I think are going to be profound in Japan.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I need to stop. I'm sorry I've entered into your time period. So thank you all very much.
Well, I want to thank you all for staying a little bit longer. Maybe you have no choice. It depends on your instructor, I suppose. My name is Dave Kraft, and I'm director of an organization here in Chicago called Nuclear Energy Information Service. My organization was set up 30 years ago to literally get rid of nuclear power and replace it with sustainable energy, renewable resources, and energy efficiency. And it's a tough sled here in Illinois because we're the most nuclear reliant state in the country. So what I want to do tonight is link together Chernobyl, which today is the 25th anniversary of that tragedy, the new Fukushima disaster, which is taking place in Japan as we speak, but also to bring it back home a little bit to Illinois, the most nuclear reliant state in the country. And we're going to do that probably in 15 minutes, so it could be a world's record tonight. So glad you stuck around to witness this event. So I guess you could say we're drawn together by accident tonight. Two of the world's most profound disasters have occurred regarding these nuclear facilities. But I decided shortly after the Fukushima accident began that I won't use that word anymore, and I still keep slipping on that, because Fukushima was not an accident. I have come to the conclusion that Fukushima was an intentional. And what I mean by that is simply this. From the dawn of the nuclear age, in the early 1950s, we had the above-ground weapons tests, and we knew the effects of radiation from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 1957, in England, we had a severe fire which released intense amounts of radiation, which polluted the Irish landscape and the Irish Sea to the point where animals had to be slaughtered, milk couldn't be drunk in Ireland. Later in 1957, you had another incident, the Kishtim incident, which was referred to earlier, the Chelyabinsk disaster in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union, which was kept a secret for many, many decades. From the West primarily, but even from many people in the Soviet Union. In 1966, we had a partial meltdown of the Fermi 1 reactor outside of Detroit City, which may be good news for Bulls fans, but it terrified the people in the Detroit area. Then again in 1979, we had the partial meltdown of the 3 Mile Island reactor core in Pennsylvania, followed by the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, the world's worst nuclear catastrophe. And then we couldn't even wait for the big one in Fukushima. We had to fill in the blanks a little bit more. And Japan was once again very obliging in that regard. There was an accident at a place called Tokaimura in the year 2000, or 2001, I may have that wrong, 10 years before, which wasn't a nuclear power station, but it was a facility where they were blending fuel, did it irresponsibly, killed 2 workers, and irradiated a sizable portion of the nearby neighborhood. Just 4 years before Fukushima, a 6.9 magnitude earthquake on the other side of the same island incapacitated 8 nuclear reactors at the same site for over a year, caused significant damage at one, and resulted in a small amount of radioactive material being released into the Pacific Ocean. Now, I ask you, if you had a driving record like that, would you be getting into another car accident? No. This was not an accident. Everything was known ahead of time. We knew what the radiation effects would be. We knew that the technology was prone to failure. And in this particular case, perhaps criminally so. So we knew in advance that this could happen. The great irony is the reactors did exactly as they were designed to do. They melted down in the absence of cooling water and caught fire and exploded. That is part of the design basis of the reactors at Fukushima, Japan. So this was no accident. There are no more nuclear accidents after a train wreck list like that. And that's what we as a society now have to come to grips with, is the genie is out of the bottle and he's a psychopath. And we have to get him back in. if we're going to have an energy future or even a civilization future. So that's really what we're talking about here. So today, the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl, we are also mourning the second nuclear assault to Japan, the Fukushima disaster. So I hope to bust a few of the myths that are pervasive in the media about all of these incidents, disasters, and catastrophes tonight. Surprise. But we are going to talk about Chernobyl first. And I decided I wanted to use the Ukrainian spelling because the Ukrainians, at least half of them, really don't care much for the Russians anymore. And the Russians spell it with an E. I think we owe them at least that respect to call it what they call it. So this is the Chernobyl 4 reactor today, and the concrete sarcophagus that was built over that reactor many, many years ago. The one that Dr. Patterson mentioned is deteriorating, and now we're going to make it look like the Charles de Gaulle airport again, with this big overhang in a kind of Quonset hut configuration. But Chernobyl didn't always look this good. 25 years ago, it looked like that. That's a 7-story building reduced to rubble by an incredible series of explosions. One initially very short radioactive explosion, followed by steam explosions, and followed by a catastrophic fire, which propelled hundreds of millions of curies of radiation around the world. Here's another view of the same site, somewhat later. This is an aerial view of the site. Total disaster at Chernobyl 25 years ago. Yesterday afternoon at 4:23, about 20 of us gathered on the University of Chicago campus because at that site down there is a statue, a sculpture done by Henry Moore, and it's the sculpture to atomic energy, because at that spot, on December 3rd, 1942, Enrico Fermi did his first sustained chain reaction, which launched the nuclear age. And we thought, what better place to go to say it's time to end the nuclear age? So 20 of us gathered at that site, laid a wreath and a flower there, did a little speechifying like we're doing tonight, but we dedicated ourselves to making sure that this never happens again, because Fukushima was one too many. This is just a quick map giving you an idea of the degree of contamination of just one isotope from the Chernobyl disaster. And as you can see, again, Belarus, Ukraine, Western Russia was heavily contaminated with cesium. Now I use cesium as the reference point here because it's one of those persistent kinds of radionuclides, and it's very bioactive. It's the one that they really worry about over the long haul because of its length of time in the environment. So when Dr. Patterson's talking about scraping away the topsoil, look what you have to scrape away. Where do you scrape a country and put it when you're done? I don't know the answer to that. But this is only one of many isotopes that were released at Chernobyl, certainly one that's worrisome today and will be worrisome in the most highly densely packed country on the planet practically in terms of population in land. This was the Chernobyl fallout map, which I took from a brand new book. It just came out last year. Brought some show and tell tonight. Traditionally, the problem we've had with the Chernobyl disaster is that only Western interpretations of what happened count. You don't listen to those godless commies, or the ones that aren't godless anymore since the wall fell. So their data doesn't matter. The way they do science doesn't matter as much as ours here in the West, because we do it better, because our reactors are better than theirs, right? So for many, many decades, we had problems of actually hearing the Eastern European version from a medical, health, and radiological standpoint. The second barrier we had was language. There just weren't folks doing the translating of these complicated studies from Eastern literature into the West. Well, finally, several of the Eastern European scientists banded together and changed that equation and came out with a book just last year called Chernobyl, Consequences of the Catastrophe for People and the Environment. It was printed at the New York Academy of Sciences and had a very, very limited release, which sold out completely. but you can now actually get this for $10, available at a very special printer in New York, and you can get it on Amazon Kindle for $2.95. So, if you're into Kindle, you can actually hear and read what the Eastern European interpretation of the Chernobyl disaster is. And this is one of the maps that I took from the book. Shows the distribution all over the entire northern hemisphere from Chernobyl. Oops, sorry. Now I want to go to some of the myths, at least two of my favorites. You will constantly hear in the press that only, and you can fill in the number here, 32, 28, 33, 55. It sounds like I'm calling signals. I'm not. These are the ridiculous numbers that the Western press continues to use in describing the Chernobyl disaster. Only this number of people died. And it is true, those people did die. But that would be like describing World War II as that really unfortunate circumstance where 2,000 sailors, Marines, and soldiers died on December 7th, 1941. And then you forget about the rest. It is a blatant distortion of history to refer to that number, and I'm really sick and tired of Western journalists using it, and I'm tempted to go after their journalist credentials if they keep doing it, because it is a real deliberate misrepresentation of a world-changing event that we have an obligation to correct. The second set of myths that I really get to, this has been going on for decades because I made this up about 15 years ago, is that Chernobyl can't happen here because we build better reactors, they're stronger, Western technology is inherently better than what the Soviets had, and our reactors have protective containments, which Chernobyl did not. And there are elements of every one of those phrases that are absolutely true. But I say elements, and I'm going to describe some of the controversy about some of it. So how many died? Honestly, it's irrelevant in a sense. When you're talking thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, as you heard earlier from Dr. Patterson, the range is very large depending on who's doing the studying, what are the parameters of the study, and things like that. But at least we can guarantee you it ain't 55. When you're going orders of magnitude greater, and responsible epidemiologists, statisticians, governments are coming up with numbers over and over again that are orders of magnitude greater than the official release, you have to start questioning who's cooking the books here. Now, Dr. Yuri Sherbak, who at the time, this is the 10th anniversary of Chernobyl, was the Ukrainian ambassador to the United States, said that a number that was printed by Greenpeace Ukraine of 32,000 deaths was not unreasonable. And that was at the 10th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster. Since then, who knows how many more have died. But others have done studies since which elevate that number again into the high tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands. There's a documentary you can see online for free, but we are going to show it as a DVD showing repeatedly over the summer called The Battle of Chernobyl. You can get this on Google or you can get it on YouTube. If you do it on YouTube, they have those annoying 9-minute breaks. It's kind of a pain. So find it on another source online for free. The Battle of Chernobyl. And this is a documentary where they went back and they interviewed the Russians. They didn't interview the Western scientists. And General Nikolai Atonchin said that when he took his helicopter pilots in, the guys who were dumping all of the lead and the sand and the boron on the reactor, 600 of them died. 600 is bigger than 55, isn't it? At least in the West. Second thing you'll see in the movie is that in order to try and stabilize the site, they had to burrow under the Chernobyl reactor to try and make a tunnel so that they could originally, their intention was to put a cooling unit down there to cool down what was they were fearing was a meltdown. They brought in thousands, 10,000 miners from Siberia, professional miners, who worked 24/7 constantly to dig this tunnel and build this area. And in the documentary, it's reported that 2,500 of them died from various radiation poisonings. So our Western literature is based on a lot of interesting preconceptions about actually examining what goes on in these kinds of disasters. There's a very interesting book called Chernobyl, The Forbidden Truth, done by a journalist named Alla Yarishnovskaya. You can get this online, but it's a very expensive book. And she chronicles in here exactly the kinds of things that Dr. Patterson referred to earlier. The military professional medical people were ordered to not use diagnoses relating to any kind of radiation exposure unless it was just so obvious that you had to do it. So you have the distortion of the medical record. The second thing you do as time goes on, if you try and do some sort of study about this, is you not only have to study the population that's exposed, you have to find a credible control group. Where are you going to find a control group, if you remember that map back there, that hasn't either been contaminated by the airborne contamination from Chernobyl, or the mixing of the radioactive and non-radioactive food, which is going on to this day, or the water, which people have to drink. So it's really a disaster in a medical and epidemiological sense, which has also been covered up, which leads to artificially low data in terms of the consequences. Now, the other myth about our technology was better than theirs, and it is true. Western reactors have containments which are superior, in fact, existent, compared to the old Soviet RBMK reactors which exploded at Chernobyl. That is true. But that's about as far as it goes, because when you start going into some of the details, you start hearing about the similarities between the Soviet RBMK reactors and our reactors. One of which is a type of what they call pressure suppression system, which was designed to alleviate pressure and had some similarities to, coincidentally, the pressure suppression systems of the Fukushima Mark I reactors that blew up a month and a half ago. And, more significantly, similar to the four Mark I reactors we have here in Illinois, and I'll show you a map of those in a moment. So the question is, yes, it's true, the old Soviet reactors are terrible. They should all have been closed down, perhaps should never have been opened. But we should not confuse the fact that our own reactors have their own unique set of vulnerabilities, and that's what we're going to get to at the end of the presentation tonight. So let's take a look at what our reactors are like. I was following the press accounts for the first 2 weeks of the Fukushima disaster, and I was noticing language being used in press releases from TEPCO, the utility, from the Japanese government, and even from our own Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Western press. And I noticed early on that there was this sort of distancing going on. It's like, those Japanese reactors did this, that, and the other. They did this. The reactors at Fukushima were built between 1971 and 1979. There are 6 reactors on the site. Back then, one of the only games in town, if you wanted to build that type of reactor, was a company called General Electric. These were not godless Soviets. They were American corporate entrepreneurs who sold these reactors to the Japanese. So I really bristle when I hear about those Japanese reactors blowing up. This was our technology. We need to own that. We need to be honest about it. Our technology blew up, caught fire, drained the pools, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can't blame the Japanese for that. They just bought it. So let's move on to the next disaster at Fukushima. This will go pretty quick. I wanted to get you an idea of the devastation there, and there's some incredible high-resolution photographs which can only be taken by aerial drone because the radiation fields are so intense. Now this is what we sold the Japanese. This is the General Electric boiling water reactor Mark I containment schematic. That gray area at the top that covers the facility is largely what blew up in those photographs that you saw, or maybe you saw the movies of the incredible explosions at the site. And that was not very well reinforced. The actual reinforced area is this sort of light bulby area in the center, and particularly within that, there's a steel encased area called the reactor vessel. So that represents the defense in depth, structural, robust, these are the terms that the regulators used, reactor components that were supposed to keep 1,000 Hiroshima's worth of radiation contained. This is our technology. Now, what about this technology? In 1972, a member of the Atomic Energy Commission of the United States, Dr. Stephen Hanauer, wrote the commission saying, the AEC should adopt a policy of discouraging further use of the pressure suppression containments, such as the Mark I's. And he had very detailed engineering rationale for this. He said the containment was too small compared to the amount of pressure that was going to build up in the case of a serious accident. So it was definitely like having a pop bottle that's just inadequate to the task. It will blow its cork. That was his warning in 1972. By that time, we had already built 3.5 reactors here in Illinois of that type. And we sold the rest to the Japanese afterwards because the Atomic Energy Commission and its successor did not discourage the sale of the Mark I containments worldwide. So you might have thought that was just some wacko guy from the Atomic Energy Commission where you had professional differences, except that in 1986, Dr. Harold Denton of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the director of nuclear reactor regulation, was addressing a conference, and he said the Mark I containments are inadequate, and in the case of a severe extreme accident scenario, they have a 90% chance of failing. In 1986, he said this. So again, I say, these are no accidents. The information was out there, it was ignored. This is what a Mark I containment looks like. Now, this pressure suppression system, which I referred to, how many of you are engineers? Joe? Okay, you might know what that means. But anyway, it's largely this donut thing at the bottom with these tubes that go into this container. The idea is that there's a steam buildup inside, it's very hot, and in the donut you have water, and sometimes in some reactors you actually have ice. And the idea is that you open up these vents, and what will happen is that the steam contacting the water will condense back into a water form and relieve pressure. That was the theory, and I'm really simplifying it a lot here. But that was the idea that was supposed to prevent the pop bottle from releasing its contents. But this is one of the areas that they think, at least in one of the reactors, ruptured and caused severe problems at Fukushima. Now, I'm going to show you what happens to the Mark I containment when you build up too much pressure. This is reactor number 3. And it's a controversial one because this was the reactor that also had the plutonium in it. It's specialized fuel called MOX. And most of the other reactors just had uranium primarily. This was a deliberately blended fuel that had plutonium and uranium in it. That pile of sticks on top was the entire gray area you saw in the schematic before. It got blown half a mile into the air in the explosion that resulted. That used to be a 7-story building. So this is roughly ground level, a couple levels up. That's Unit 3. Another view of this from the top. This is a side view looking towards the Pacific Ocean. You have Unit 3 on the left. As again, you can see that used to be the gray area in the schematic. It's just a bunch of pickup sticks now. Unit 4 got off a little easier. But the one, I'll show you one more view here. This is the other side of it. Unit 3 is on the right. You can see the walls now a little bit better. Where is it here? You can see how many levels have actually been blown apart by the hydrogen explosion that occurred at this reactor. Now, I didn't show you something. I'm going to back up on the schematic because it's very significant here. Towards the top, you see this thing that sort of looks like an accordion stretched out here, these lines. That's a very significant part of this reactor, and it's also one of the design flaws of this reactor. That little box is called the spent fuel pool. It is a very specialized, very glorified swimming pool, 5 stories up in the air, which takes the used fuel from the reactor and stores it underwater until it's cool enough to be moved somewhere else or disposed of permanently. So think about that a minute. You have a swimming pool 5 stories up in the air, above ground, and then you have an amazing explosion that blows apart the top of the building, as you just saw. The piping that feeds cooling water into that spent fuel pool is essential to keep the temperatures down so that the fuel doesn't melt, because it's still very hot in terms of radiation and thermally. So you have these hydrogen explosions blowing off 1/3 of the reactor at an area in the plant where you have your swimming pool 5 stories up in the air. On this planet, water goes down. So this was the design of the Mark I containment, and that's why it was so flawed. You heard in the news perhaps about what they call spent fuel pool fires. And it was simply because both the circulation and perhaps the piping, we still don't know, we can't get close enough because the radiation is so intense, drained the cooling water out of those pools, exposing the old fuel elements to the air. The heat just kept building up and building up and building up. It boiled off a lot of the water. And finally, those old fuel rods caught fire. And it's a very specialized kind of fire. It's one sort of like, you ever use sparklers when you were a kid? You know, you light them and they, very similar to that. It was a very intense chemical reaction that occurred. And these fuel rods undergo that kind of fire every so often because there's still nothing up there to cool down these fuel assemblies. So this was our technology. It wasn't the godless Soviets who sold this to the Japanese. Let's bring it home, and then we'll go into question and answer mode. We have opposed nuclear Illinois for 30 years. The map over there is the same one you see up here, because we have 14 reactors here in Illinois. 11 operate, 3 are closed down. And if we were a nation, we would be number 12 in the world, tied with China. Or maybe they have 1 or 2 more now, so maybe we're number 13. How lucky. After 9/11, we added a feature to our map, though, because you may have heard that the regulators here and the head of the utility, Exxon Corporation, said he has every confidence. He believes our reactors are safe here because Illinois doesn't have tsunamis. He was kind of joking when he said it. It's true, we don't. Okay, I concede that. But every one of these reactors that you see up here is built on a 500-year floodplain. The New Madrid Fault, which is down here, may or may not have influence seismically similar to what occurred in Japan at some point in the future. But we have one thing the Japanese don't have, and that's the world's busiest airport. And this is significant because, again, when you have a swimming pool 5 stories up in the air, it doesn't matter if it's an earthquake shaking it loose, a hydrogen explosion, a tsunami, whatever, or an airliner crashing into it. Any of those can be the instigator of a scenario which can cause a serious nuclear accident. So we in Illinois don't have to worry about tsunamis. We just have to worry about a repeat of 9/11 coming out of O'Hare Field. So this is the significance for us here in Illinois of the Japanese situation. And the kicker is we have 4 of those same vintage, same design, even older reactors than the Japanese did. 2 at Quad Cities on the Mississippi River, and Dresden 2 and 3, which are 55 miles southwest of Chicago near Morris, Illinois. So for us, this is a very significant issue. Now, I talked to Dr. Patterson earlier about what he was going to talk about, what we were going to do. And I wanted to talk a little bit more in detail, especially since one of the questioners brought it up, is the issue of what would we do in case of an emergency, a nuclear emergency here in Illinois. And I want to talk about 3 particular items. The emergency response plans that we have in Illinois are enormous. It's a series of telephone books full of procedures, who's responsible for what do you do in this circumstance, and there's a phone book for every kind of nuclear accident, whether it's a reactor, a transportation accident, a spent fuel pool. It's a very elaborate plan which pulls in dozens of different kinds of governmental entities, from everything from the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Homeland Security Department down to your local state police and cops on the street out at Morris, Illinois. Everybody has a role. But again, plans exist in books. Will they work in practice? And I think we have to take a look and learn some of the lessons of what happened at 3 Mile Island, what happened at Chernobyl, and what is happening currently in Japan to get an idea of not just what we should be doing, but where are our weaknesses so that we can be ready if something like this does happen in the future. So I'll get ahead of my game to mention that after the disaster in Fukushima, my organization requested a meeting with Governor Quinn, and he gave us an hour. And we started bringing up some of these issues of concerns that we have about the Illinois Emergency Response Plan. I'll give you an example of one of the flaws we see in it. Now, again, I'm going on old data, and the 911 situation and Homeland Security have prevented us from going back and re-examining these documents. But previously, the Illinois National Guard had a very, very important role to play in dealing with a radiological emergency, especially around a reactor. They would direct traffic, they would prevent looting, they would set up different kinds of centers for people. Well, we knew back in the 1980s that this was a lot of nonsense when Ronald Reagan shipped off the entire Illinois National Guard to Honduras. Right. Where is our Guard today?
In Iraq.
Iraq, Afghanistan, maybe Libya next, I don't know. The point is, that exposes one of the vulnerabilities. You're taking out an essential component of your emergency response and shipping it off halfway around the world. So the reality of an emergency response plan is something we need to pay attention to. Dr. Patterson alluded to the emergency planning zone. The federal regulators in this country require the utilities to make a plan for emergency response within a 10-mile radius of each of those reactors on the map. That's the law. Okay, fine. But the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was in Japan and recommended that, for some reason, perhaps we're genetically inferior, Americans who were within 50 miles of Fukushima should be evacuated. But the Japanese stayed, which was very strange. But the other strange thing was, why is it Americans in Japan are at risk within 50 miles, but in the United States, the utilities only have to plan for 10? There seems to be a disconnect going on here, okay? And that's one of the inconsistencies we brought up with Governor Quinn. The final example I'll use is the use of a pill called potassium iodide. Now, maybe some of you read about this in the news. It is a pill. Its design is to fill up your thyroid gland with non-radioactive iodine, because once it's full, it's not going to take anything else in. So if you're exposed to radioactive iodine, it literally just shoots through your body, goes out with your urine. Not a problem. The kicker is you got to take it before you're exposed, usually. I've heard different doctors and different estimates saying you can take it a few hours afterwards. You heard Dr. Patterson say today within a day. Some of the literature I have read says if you take it afterwards, you actually make the situation worse. So the literature is contradictory on this. But the general consensus is you take it before, you avoid the harm. That is why Polish children did not have thyroid problems after Chernobyl, and that is why 8,000 Belarusian children lost their thyroids, because they didn't get potassium iodide. That's the difference. Now, the other thing I would say here is how do we have this set up in our 10-mile zone? Originally, there was no federal obligation to even store this stuff or even have it on hand. Then they changed the rules so that, well, we might make it available at these centers that people should go to get the pill. But if you're here and the center is 20 miles away and there's a radioactive plume in between you, you're going to have a problem because you're going to go through the radiation to get the pill that's supposed to protect you from it. So that didn't seem to work out very well. Finally, the federal regulators, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, relented and said, all right, we're going to buy a whole stash of this stuff, and we will make it available to states that want it for distribution. So guess which state refused to take the voluntary potassium iodide? Any guesses? Bingo! Illinois refused. Why did they refuse? Because the state administrators couldn't figure out a way to really make the program manageable. They were worried about people overdosing and kids getting in the medicine chest and taking it and blah, blah, blah. The point is, nobody required the households within that 10-mile zone to stock this stuff, which is the recommendation of the American Thyroid Association. In fact, their recommendation is households within 50 miles of a site should have this in their medicine chest. So again, we have issues, to say the least, with the emergency evacuation plants here in Illinois. Now, Dr. Patterson's group 5 years ago had the Chicago chapter premiere of a slideshow which will really knock your socks off. I'll be right with you on that. PSR got a hold of the code that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission uses to analyze radioactive accidents. And they ran computer simulations of a nuclear accident at the Braidwood Nuclear Power Station, southwest of Chicago, down here. And what we find here, using the PSR simulations, which are very expensive to do, and they were so expensive that their grant ran out, that a sizable portion of, well, certainly all of Chicago, parts of northeast Illinois, northwest Indiana, and southwest Michigan would get some form of dose from a serious accident at Braidwood based on prevailing winds in the summer. So if your potassium iodide is on the other side of that green blotch, you're in trouble. This is the evacuation area and the amount of radiation people would be exposed to within the areas. Again, it's kind of difficult to interpret, but I wanted just to show you the gross picture of what you could expect in terms of evacuation and dosages and the numbers of people involved. This is what would happen if there were a spent fuel pool problem at Braidwood. Much different kind of accident, but certainly not one out of the realm of possibility. Fortunately, the spent fuel pools at Braidwood are at ground level and not up in the air. This would be the spent fuel pool evacuation area that you would have to do and the amount of dosage you would get as a result of that disaster. And this is a specialized incident of they want to start moving radioactive waste around on trains. Well, if there were a problem with one of the casks in the shipping casks, this is the kind of plume you would get and how people would be affected at different distances from a train accident. So as I said, there are many elaborations on these incidents, accidents, and scenarios. So what did we recommend to the governor? We broke it up into 4 chunks for him. We said we have immediate concerns about the reactor design, the Mark I reactors, the spent fuel pools, and how they store radioactive waste there. We also have problems with the emergency response and planning issues, which we just went over in some detail. But then we had to warn him that your best intentions will be thwarted by the federal regulators because they are part of the problem. They are part of the system which thwarts effective citizen involvement, thwarts effective action to protect the health and safety of the public from the governor's point of view. And that he will have to work as a governor with other governors to get the feds to change their act. I think Dr. Patterson referred to this as the nuclear industrial complex. Well, this is it in spades. So that gets through the PowerPoint. And what we're going to be doing is following up with the governor on these recommendations, but we're going to really need a push from behind. There are 330 million Americans, I would say 99% of whom knew virtually nothing of what you heard tonight, who are going to have to make a decision about their energy future. Is it going to be sustainable, renewable, based on efficiency, conservation, based on energy resources that don't wipe out entire metropolitan areas? We think it should be, and we have the technology to do it. The problem is we have 2 industries that stand in the way, the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry. And as long as they keep feeding at the federal trough, we will not get a sustainable energy future. Now, some of you students who are here, did you happen to hear of a conference that took place the last 2 weeks called Power Shift? Anybody? Well, 10,000 of your colleagues showed up in Washington, D.C. 2 weekends ago to plan a sustainable energy future. And they do this every 2 years. So if you're an underclassman for the next few years, I hope I will see you in Washington in 2 years, because I was there the last 2 times. You have an environmental group on campus here that needs to debate these kinds of issues and talk about this. Because we have to push all together if we really want a different kind of energy future, which guarantees we won't have a Chernobyl again or a Fukushima again. So I want to thank you, and I want to get to the question and as many other questions as you're willing to stay for. So.
Well, I was just going to ask how long the potassium iodide lasts. I mean, do you just take it once and then you're good for months on end, or?
The instructions on the boxes that I have, IOSAT, potassium iodide, are very explicit. You take a tablet a day. If you're a child, you take a smaller portion. The tablets are scored so you can break them up properly. You just follow the instructions. And apparently that was just too mind-boggling for the Illinois Department of Nuclear Safety to implement as a program. So you can get IOSAT on your own. Some people have already done it. What really galled me, though, was people were gouging unsuspecting people who were trying to legitimately protect their families, charging 10, 15, 100 times more than what this stuff really costs on the internet. So I'm urging you not to be duped, first of all. But yes, you can actually have a stash of your own. It has about a 5-year shelf life. Sometimes 7 is what I've heard. There are other forms of iodine you can take which have a longer shelf life. So does that answer your question?
Okay, I'm curious about these other forms. Do they work as well?
Yes. There's a form called potassium iodate, which is a slightly different version. And you got to make sure you don't get the industrial version because it's a caustic material. But you can get iodate, and it has a longer shelf life.
Okay, and so is there any stockpiling of this potassium iodine in Illinois?
I forgot to mention that, yes. Illinois finally relented. The Department of Nuclear Safety, which is now under the IEMA organization, the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, has agreed to stockpile a quantity here in Illinois. And at a hearing, which was convened by Senators Kirk and Durbin a week after the Fukushima disaster, the director of IEMA said he had about, I'm going on memory here, so I might be wrong, somewhere around 120 to 150,000 doses available. But they were stockpiled. They were not distributed. That, they still leave it up to the municipality to decide if they want, or the county government to do it. So they have it, but it's not distributed.
So it's only 120 to 150,000?
They're only stockpiling enough for the people who live within those 10-mile zones. And keep in mind, the American Thyroid Association recommended planning for 50-mile zone. So, okay? Okay.
Just 2 comments to follow up to that question. 1 tablet will protect you for 1 day.
Yeah.
So you need enough tablets as long as the iodine cloud is passing or there's radioiodine contamination in milk or other places.
Other questions or comments? To the mic, please.
So, after the accident at Fukushima, we heard a lot about ocean water. The Japanese were using water to try to put out the fires, and then there were helicopters dropping water on if they could. And now we've heard that maybe some of that water is going back into the ocean, because I saw on your slide that it's inches away from the ocean. So, I mean, the Pacific Ocean's a big place. So, you know, there's the opportunity for that radioactive water to mix with some non-radioactive water. On the other hand, I'm not buying any fish from Japan for my family. And I already can't buy Gulf fish, so we're limited now in our fish consumption. But can you tell us a little bit about that water? And is that something to worry about, and what happens to it?
There are two.
To that used now radioactive water.
Yeah, there are two versions of the answer. There's the version that goes, and this is the regulatory agency speaking, don't worry, it'll be diluted. It's not going to be harmful. The ocean currents will dissipate it. But as Dr. Patterson mentioned earlier, the fish don't read the signs. So the signs that say don't swim in the radioactive water, either they can't read it in Japanese or in English, I'm not sure which. But the point is, the ocean is a living, vibrant, dynamic system. And it reconcentrates these radionuclides. They're talking thousands of tons of irradiated water contaminated with God knows what that was in that core that all got released. And it is oozing its way into the oceans. Now, it's bad enough just to say that, but you have to layer on that one more context, that in Japan, the ocean is very significant in the food supply because you have the seaweeds that are there. In fact, it's ironic that various seaweeds are used to actually deal with some radiation poisonings because they are very good adsorbents and they take it out of your body. That's what they were administering as homeopathic remedies in the Chernobyl area because they couldn't afford anything else to begin with. But seaweed is good at that. So what do you think it's going to do in the ocean? It's going to suck that stuff up. The Japanese people eat seaweed, and if they don't, the fish do. So you have everything from seabed contamination because the heavier stuff will settle into the sediment. The mollusks will concentrate it down there. You have the swimming fish, which will either eat each other or will eat the seaweeds. And then you have the population. How do you possibly draw a line around that in the ocean and say healthy, not healthy, healthy or not? This is a catastrophe. This is why it's a catastrophe. There is no limit to it. And I can't give you an answer of what's safe or what isn't. All I can say is they're dumping it. That was a last gasp effort to try and contain the catastrophe. They had no other choice. And now they're going to pay further down the road with another form of catastrophe, which is ocean pollution. They've actually detected these radionuclides, I believe it's 36 kilometers away from the site already.
Which way?
I don't know. Out. I really don't know. I think it's to the northeast, yeah. That's the best I can do, I'm sorry. But that is something that international agencies should certainly track and keep an eye on. And that should be insisted at the United Nations level, that that area, that region be tested, be monitored for this kind of contamination and re-bioconcentration.
I'm wondering, I mean, I'm a little confused about what's going on in Japan right now with the nuclear reactor. And I know it's not totally under control, and I'm wondering, do you have any idea when it will be under control and what they need to do to get it under control and how much more damage it could do, things of that nature? Yeah.
They're not out of the woods. It's still a very volatile, unpredictable situation. Certain things probably won't happen, but we're not quite sure. They can't get close enough yet to see how bad the damage is to know even what to do about it. That's going to take at least 9 months to a year to figure out. It took them 5 years to figure out 3 Mile Island, which by comparison was a little firecracker. So this could take years to unravel in terms of determining what went wrong, what can they do to contain it. They're actually talking now about building an underground wall, as you can see this in this diagram, between the reactors and the seacoast to try and keep that seawater from migrating into the ocean. They're going to be trying everything they possibly can. The critical point, though, is they still have to keep what's left of those reactors cool from further melting, from further recriticalities, and then they got to deal with the spent fuel pools, which I spent no time talking about tonight, but that's where the real action is in terms of radiation. So it's still a mess. They don't know, and they can't get people close enough because periodically there are these bursts and clouds of radiation that threaten the workers.
What's going on with those pools right now?
Spent fuel pools, as far as we know, still don't have water in them, some of them. They're not having the fires that they did, but periodically they do find reports of smoke. Now, I mentioned earlier that little sparkler effect, and there's a theoretical way that they think these fires reignite themselves in the spent fuel pools because they don't have sufficient cooling and moderating material to prevent that from happening. So there may be periodic fires like this for months, as far as we know, until they can get that material underwater again.
First of all, thank you so much for your talk tonight and for all of your work. And I want to know what, as citizens, we can do to support your work and to, what is it you recommend that we do?
Okay, two-part question. I guess we can do a little commercial plugging here. I was going to say, you know, it doesn't matter what group you support, but there are 330 million Americans that now have to decide to invest $10 a year on whatever environmental group of their choice is to stop nuclear power and fossil fuels. I totally agree with Andy, who I've known a number of years also, that fossil fuels are just abysmal. So there are many, many organizations dedicated to ending the fossil fuel age and the nuclear age. You pick the one of your choice and go for it. Because you got to figure, these guys are getting 12 of your payments every year to keep you using coal and keep you using nuclear. It's called your electric bill. So pick an organization, get behind it. Second thing is, come to presentations like this, invite people like Dr. Patterson. Get them back. Get them on the news. We need to hear that other voice, that there is another way, from responsible, intelligent people. I'm just a no-nukes kook. I've been around 30 years. I have no training in this. My background originally was clinical mental health. I would have to say I'm dealing with crazier people now than I was back 20 years ago. That's arguable. But the point is, you know, if I can figure it out, if I can do this, if I can learn this, so can you. And that's it. We need an informed citizenry. And this has been destroyed in this country in the last 30 years. So that's the second thing you can do. The other thing is, dare to be embarrassed. If you're not willing to make a fool of yourself by saying these things in public, they're just going to keep happening. So this is actually free therapy, is to get involved with a group and come to meetings like this and raise your voice, because what you have to say is important. You go to those meetings where Senator Durbin and Kirk want more nuclear plants, and you say, wait a minute, guys, you know, we've got a lake here. We won't have a tsunami, but we want to keep it as a drinking water supply, okay? So no more nukes, please. You have that right. So all I'm really telling you is protect yourself. If you have children, you're protecting them. If you don't, imagine you did, because you're really fighting for the future generations. This is a real war right now that we're in with these guys, and we got to stop them, or we're going to have more of these. So I gave you like 3 stock answers, but honestly, it's like what Gandhi said, whatever you do may seem insignificant, but it's extremely important that you do those. They are necessary and sufficient to stop these industries. And only we can do it. Is that satisfactory for the moment? Or? I mean, beyond that, you can write letters to the editors. You all have opinions that are worth something. Last thing I would say, because you mentioned coal earlier, our organization for 5 years now has been supporting the local environmental justice effort to shut down the Fisk and Crawford coal plants here in Chicago. 2 100-year coal plants that should have been closed a long time ago. And a few months back, we actually presented testimony before the EPA saying EPA needs to regulate coal emissions for radiation content because there are no standards in coal. And the coal ash, in many cases, has more radioactive material in it than what you would get exposed to if you walked by a nuclear plant. This is nuts. So we are also against fossil fuels and the radiation content from coal. There are lots of community groups in Chicago that are fighting to close those coal plants down. And a week ago, they got screwed royally by the Chicago City Council, which refused to hold a vote on the Chicago Clean Power Ordinance, which would have regulated those plants. Don't sit for that anymore. Get angry enough to go down there and not leave City Hall until you get what you want. I could go on this, but I'm not going to, because we have more questions. I mean, you have plenty to do now, too.
Good evening. I would have a question regarding the kind of alternative energy we can use to prevent the use of nuclear energy. Because there was a study carried out in my country, in France, that was trying to solve this problem by replacing nuclear energy by solar energy. And they said that they had to cover actually an entire region with only solar powers to produce the exact same energy. So what kind of alternative energy would you recommend to replace it?
Now, I couldn't comment on the specific study because I don't know what aspects or how deep they went into certain things. But my first answer should appeal to most Americans is don't just do something, stand there. What I mean by that is before we go out and build stuff to give us more electrons that we waste, let's take a look at what we're wasting and stop wasting them. So energy efficiency has to be the first response. And I don't know what the situation is in France in terms of energy efficiency. If it's anything like the United States, we waste as much, and maybe some estimates twice as much of the entire output of all 104 nuclear reactors here in this country. Wasted through things like lights that get left on all the time, Barbie boutique for your kids, electric toothbrush. The whole gamut of electronic nonsense has driven up the so-called demand for electricity and gives them the justification to keep building. So we have to stop that addictive process. And in this regard, I'm coming from my previous profession. We are energy addicts here in this country. It is not a rational choice. It is an addiction, a consumer addiction that we have to address. So that has nothing to do with building anything. It has a little bit to do with soul searching. But to get to I think where you really wanted to go here, it's going to be a combination of things depending on the region, depending on the resources available. Last time I heard, there's a considerable amount of sunshine in Arizona. So solar would work there very nicely. Why did they have the nation's largest nuclear plant there? Let's figure that one out. Wind power. Can't be done. Can't do wind power, right? It could never be baseload power, except that in Illinois alone, our wind power output is greater than the Dresden nuclear power station. So you're not getting the full story. That's the other part. Texas is the largest wind power producing state in the country, produces almost the equivalent of the entire nuclear output of Illinois, and wind alone. No solar. So there are studies and studies and studies that have been in Scientific American, in Science, in Nature. Read the literature, you will see that we have the technological capabilities, but we have to plan ahead and implement them intelligently to replace fossil fuels and nuclear fuels. There's a website you can go to, it's called carbonfree.nuclearfree.org, which lays it out as a blueprint and says we can do this by 2040. Now that's the United States. I would suggest that EDF or somebody hires the guy who wrote the book and brings him to France and does the analysis there. France and Japan are two energy impoverished countries, so that is true. That is why the French turned to nuclear and why Japan did as well after the Arab oil embargo in 1970s. But that's because they were dumb enough to be hitching their wagons to oil in the first place. So let's not make the same mistake twice. It has to be diverse, it has to be sustainable, but it has to start with meeting needs and not addictive wants. Does that help? Okay. A little side question while Mo gets to the microphone. I've had many nuclear people coming up to me saying the same thing that the French study concluded. Do you know how much square mileage you would need in solar panels to replace one nuclear plant? Well, I don't. But I do know, have any of you ever flown in O'Hare Field? Anybody? What? Have you ever flown into O'Hare Field?
Oh, yeah.
How about Midway? You ever look down and wonder, why is it only rain puddles on those flat roofs and not solar panels? We have miles and miles of square footage out there, you know, that is usable for solar panels. It isn't. We don't have to cut down any trees. We don't have to get rid of any deserts. None of that elaborate nonsense if we do it locally. So that's another thing we need to take a look at, is what we're not doing.
Okay. First of all, David, thank you for your presentation. Well worth the drive.
Oh, thank you.
Ridge.
She came from Iowa. No, just kidding.
No. But for those of you who want to become active, I know that David's organization can always use the help I started I'm a former teacher. I taught in the Chicago public schools for 20 years. Wasn't sure what former teachers did and became an environmental activist. When we moved to the western burbs, I found out about toxic waste incinerators being sited and started working with local municipal government. And while Chicago is a tough nut to crack, on the coal issue, it took me 9 years to do it, but I got resolutions from 102 municipalities representing over 8 million in Metro Chicago. The Cook County Board gave me a unanimous resolution, as did the Will Lake, this was on the grandfathering of the old coal-fired power plants, to end the grandfathering of them. So trying to bring political pressure to bear from the people, because quite frankly, people power, once it gets energized, is about the only thing that can start to even out the balance of the huge campaign contributions that are given our elected officials. And my husband, Vince, and I attended the meeting, except we couldn't get in. They had very few seats for the public at the Dirksen Federal Building. This was the hearing that Kirk and Durbin did a few weeks back. But Senator Kirk got, just for his senatorial campaign, over $38,000 from Exelon alone. And if you look back to his previous campaigns, each one $10,000 or $15,000. So, I mean, if somebody's given you $100,000, is it unusual for him to have put out an email saying, I want 50 more reactors? So somehow we have to find the ability to leverage these dollars that are being funneled in to Washington, to our state elected officials. I think that Pat Quinn, I find him to be an honorable man. I've known him for many years. And I think that we finally have somebody who's not going to end up wearing stripes later down the road. I'm convinced of that. But on the nuclear issue, I started to try to help in terms of employing what I did on other campaigns, because we ended the toxic incinerators here in Illinois. That was a huge battle, the Illinois retail rate law. And just mobilizing citizens. And everyone has something that they can contribute, because we do not live in vacuums. We all have coworkers, family members, schoolmates that we know. And our mayors are not used to hearing from us. If they get 5 calls, they start to get nervous. The same with our other elected officials. And as a result of the anti-incinerator campaign, I ended up serving on the board of the Illinois Environmental Council for 7 years. And when it would be discussed in House or Senate subcommittees, anything pertaining to the environment that was bad, I'd get a phone call from our lobbyist in Springfield, Mo, who do you know in so-and-so's district? And if I could get 5 calls in, the person started to notice. Generally, not more than 20 calls would it take for someone to just withdraw from what they were planning to do that would have been bad for the environment. So this is something you can do as a side job. I do this as a side job for myself. I'm not paid for it. Anyone who wants to be involved can be involved. And just letters to the editor. I mean, just popping them off. And people's eyes, they have rapt attention when it comes to these kind of discussions. And what? The billions of dollars in subsidies. I mean, President Obama wants billions going into the nuclear complex. This is at a time when people are struggling, and yet we have billions to give them, just like we have billions to give the oil industry. So, I mean, get involved on some level, and it's amazing what you can accomplish with people power. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.